What's going on, guys? In today's video, we're going to talk all about appraisals. What are they? Why do we have them? How do they affect the process? And what can we do when things go wrong? Now, this is going to be kind of just a quick overview from the buyer and seller side, and we'll give kind of my take on especially what we tend to see here in Georgia. Now, backing up a little bit, what is the appraisal and the process? Typically, if a property is being sold and a buyer has a loan, there is going to be an appraisal required from the lender showing that, yes, the property is of sufficient value, so they will lend on the property. And it really comes down to risk tolerance from the lender to make sure that they're not giving somebody money for a property that's not worth it, that they won't get paid back on. So, how do we kind of get here, especially in 2024, and what's the outlook going forward? Well, back before the financial crisis in 2008, appraisals happened a little bit differently. They were much more selective in how they were picked by the person, whether it was the buyer's agent, the buyer, or the lender. Now, because of everything that happened with the lending that went awry back in 2008, the inflated property values, and the loose regulations, things have completely changed. So now, when an appraisal has to be done, that actually gets sent out to a third party company who essentially acts as an unbiased bystander and will select an appraiser from a pool of approved appraisers to go out at random and handle that property. This makes sure there's not really a lot of collusion going on. But before we get to the buy side, let's just talk about a seller. If you are an owner and you are wanting to sell your property or are kind of curious of what the value is, maybe it's a unique property, a lot of times you'll hear people want to do pre-listing appraisals or they want to get an idea. Maybe they're not really in sync with what the agent is saying the value is of the home and they want their own opinion. Now, while I think these can be valuable, a lot of times they are kind of unnecessary and slightly useless. Because if you're a seller and you have a property that you're looking for an appraisal on, what you're going to do is you're going to contact that appraisal company. They're going to ask you what you need it for. Are you doing a refinance? Are you just trying to get valuation? And when they send the appraiser out there, a lot of times they know that there's not a contract contingent on that appraisal. And they're probably going to give you a little bit of an artificially inflated value. They want you to feel like you're paying for something, you're actually getting it. And then you have this report that is a little bit more subjective and not necessarily as scrutinized as it would be if there was money on the line. Now, I say this as a detriment only because if you have 10 different appraisers go out to the property, unless it's a condo, a townhouse, or a home in a large subdivision where it's very cookie cutter, appraisals can still be pretty subjective. Now, a lot of times, if you have a appraisal coming in during the process of selling the home, the appraiser already knows that there's a contract on the property. They know what the sales price is, and they're kind of subconsciously using that to get to the value and hopefully that it appraises. So, unless your property is super unique, whether it's a lot of acreage and then a house or an equestrian estate or something outside the general scope where you want to take an appraisal that's done ahead of time and use it as a marketing tool, you can't really put a whole lot of weight behind it. And it's not like you're going to be able to give it to the buyer and then have them use that with their lender. Now, on the buy side, the appraisals are a bigger deal on the financing aspect. If you are purchasing a property with cash in Georgia, I'm sure in other areas you can still have an appraisal contingency, but that's something that you would decide to check or not on the all cash exhibit. When you're doing a finance contingency exhibit, it's going to ask you for two things in Georgia. One is the length of the financing contingency. This is going to be the period of time at which the lender needs to get you the approval and clear through the underwriting to say, yes, we will actually fund this loan. And part of the appraisal process also has to be done in that time frame. Now, I typically like to see the appraisals done as quickly as possible because it's just one less thing that the contract hinges on. We're going to have our due diligence period, you have your finance contingency running concurrently, and then the appraisal contingency. And a lot of times the holdup is the appraisal because it does get sent out to that third party company. You're at the mercy of somebody else's schedule, then going to the property, doing their valuation and turning it back in. While you can pay a rush for this, that is an additional expense that the buyer does incur. Now, The past few years, things have changed a little bit. What we saw, especially post COVID, where there was a property boom and everyone was offering over asking price, they started scaling back the appraisal contingencies just because the sellers knew that the values they were getting for homes were above and beyond what was keeping up with past sales. And because the appraisals look in the rearview mirror as far as a trailing 6 months, if the market is moving up too fast, an appraiser can't necessarily justify a current value on something that maybe sold 4 months ago when the market was a little bit different. So what we started seeing is buyers either foregoing the appraisal contingency altogether or minimizing the amount of days, or there could be an appraisal gap where they're saying, hey, we will pay above and beyond the property. We're going to pay that difference out of pocket, regardless of what it appraises for. And things can get a little crazy. Now, I really don't like this because while, yes, it's great that home values are going up and it puts more money in the seller's pocket, in the long term, it creates an imbalance for buyers where they're kind of getting into properties that don't necessarily have true equity. And that's a little bit of a problem. Now, if something does come in low, especially in Georgia, let's say you have the appraiser go out there, you have 12 days for your appraisal contingency. On day 10, you get that report back and it's not what the purchase price was. You have until the 12th day to send that notice in writing with a specific amendment to the seller requesting that they address the low appraisal and adjust the purchase price. The seller then has 3 days to respond to that. And if they do respond to that, depending on what they say, the buyer has another 3 days to get back to them. So it really could be an additional 6 days after your appraisal contingency ends that this could all be resolved. Now, if an appraisal comes in low, what happens? There are really a few different scenarios. As a seller, normally, especially in a seller's market where there are a lot of other buyers, they're less likely to just reduce the price to the appraised value. So, what we were seeing is that buyers were paying the difference out of pocket. But that does put a strain on buyers as far as their funds available, their current down payment that they're working with. And it is a little bit difficult to then recoup that down the road because you want the property to keep appreciating. But not only have you put your down payment in, you've now paid above and beyond an appraised value just to secure a property. Not something I usually recommend. When the market typically balances out a little bit more and we have more months of inventory, there's more options for buyers. A lot of times, what we see is the seller will come down to the appraised value, or it'll be a combination of what we discussed previously, where maybe the buyer pays a little bit out of pocket, the seller comes down a little bit, and they meet in the middle. This is all in an effort to just get the deal to the closing table. Now, there is no obligation for the seller to reduce the sales price just because the appraisal came in low. In the instance that this happens and they are refusing to do anything, the buyer has the ultimate choice. They can pay the difference out of pocket, or if it's within their appraisal contingency timeline still, they can back out of the contract, go find another property, and most likely keep their earnest money. So, those are the things we typically see a lot. But the market is changing, especially now as it's gotten a little bit more balanced. Prices have cooled off a little bit, and we're starting to see lenders and appraisers relax the guidelines compared to what they saw. Now, one of the interesting things that I would tell buyers to look for is we are going the way of automation. And while I think this is helpful because it can cut down on the time frame that you need to wait for somebody to actually go out to the home and their subjective opinion, the automated aspect comes with pros and cons. One pro is depending on how much money you're putting down, your lender may actually just grant you an appraisal waiver. And this is nice because you save money on having to pay for the appraisal. You don't necessarily need the contingency in the contract, and you have the peace of mind for the seller knowing that it's one less hurdle to jump through. So if you do find a property that you want to offer on, I always recommend just sending that address over to your lender, asking them about the appraisal waiver, and see if it's something that might be possible for you. Outside of the appraisal waiver, we've seen the process change a little bit. Depending on the loan structure, a lot of times they can do desktop appraisals. Now, this is where they're basically just have somebody in a remote area through the lending company, or Fannie and Freddie Mac have certain guidelines of how they approach this. And they're just looking at online sales within the same neighborhood, subdivision, school district, finding the comparables and doing a remote appraisal. If they are able to deem that the value is sufficient, that means they don't have to worry about somebody coming out to the house. So I would always ask the lender ahead of time, is it possible to get an appraisal waiver? Is it going to be a desktop appraisal? Is it going to be in person? Now, what we have started seeing is Freddie and Freddie Mac actually just released certain guidelines where it used to be 20% down for a down payment could potentially qualify you for the appraisal waiver or some of the other benefits of the desktop appraisals. But they've actually started loosening that up a little bit, coming down to 15% on some loans, 10% on others. And even as far as some of their 3% down payment programs can potentially qualify for an appraisal waiver. Now, I do see that this gets a little bit trickier when you start having these values that people are kind of just looking for ways around tried and true processes. And I do think the real estate process is completely archaic, but we do get in the territory of if somebody is not setting specific eyes on a property in person and knows the ins and outs of that neighborhood, it sometimes is very difficult to pinpoint that actual value. Now we get into that kind of gray area of, is it actually worth it? Is it most beneficial to get that waiver, the desktop appraisal? Who's it really serving at the end of the day, other than the lenders, to just try and get as many deals done as possible? So those are just some things I would keep in mind as we start seeing the market normalizing, especially shifting back to the buyer side. Appraisal contingencies have become a lot more common. And it's something that I think is pretty beneficial for all parties because it is a little bit of an internal checks and balances system. Now, if you have any questions on appraisals, or the contingencies, or what you typically expect, I'm happy to answer any questions. We have preferred lenders that are fantastic, that are happy to answer any questions. There's no paid affiliation either way. It's just all about getting the proper information to you as you need it. As always, if you are looking for a place in Alpharetta or just curious about the area, down below is my Alpharetta guide that I've created completely free with some of my best spots for the area. I hope you found this beneficial, and I will see you all in the next one. Thanks so much.